The abduction of 13-year-old Elizabeth Smart. On the night of June 5, 2002, Elizabeth Smart, a 13-year-old girl from Salt Lake City, Utah, was taken from her own home in a violent and horrifying act that would haunt her family for years. Elizabeth had been asleep in her bedroom, a typical summer night for a young teenager, when she heard footsteps in the hallway. At first, she thought it was a dream, but as the footsteps grew closer, she realized it wasn't. A man, masked and armed, broke into her room. The intruder, Brian David Mitchell, was a stranger to the family, but he had been planning this moment for months. He bound Elizabeth's hands, blindfolded her, and threatened to kill her if she screamed. His words were chilling. "I'm not going to hurt you. Yet." Her younger sister, who slept in the same room, woke up in terror, but managed to remain quiet. As Elizabeth was dragged from her room, she tried to scream, but her captor's grip was firm. They walked out of the house into the night, with the darkness closing in around her. There was no one to help. As the hours passed, Elizabeth's parents woke up to find her gone. The terror set in. The authorities were contacted immediately, but no one could have predicted how this case would unfold. They searched every corner of Salt Lake City, hoping for any sign of Elizabeth. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The only clue left behind was a note from Mitchell, left at the scene, suggesting that he had planned to take Elizabeth for a long time. Mitchell kept Elizabeth in a remote area, hidden from the world. He repeatedly threatened her and subjected her to unimaginable horrors. He told her that if she ever tried to escape or speak to anyone, he would kill her family. Elizabeth's worst fear wasn't just the torment she was enduring. It was the possibility that she would never see her family again. For 9 months, Elizabeth was trapped. She was forced to wander the streets with Mitchell and his wife, who played a role in her captivity. She was kept in isolation, hidden in plain sight, while the search for her continued. The police had no leads, and hope was beginning to fade. Then, one miraculous day, Elizabeth was walking through a public street with her captors when she was spotted by 2 experienced officers. They had seen Elizabeth's face in the media and immediately recognized her. They approached her, but Elizabeth froze. Fear gripped her heart. Would Mitchell come back to hurt her? But Elizabeth, despite the fear and doubt, managed to speak up. She identified herself as Elizabeth Smart. The officers were quick to take action, arresting Mitchell and his wife. The rescue was a turning point in the investigation, but it also marked the beginning of Elizabeth's long road to recovery. The world had watched as she had been ripped from her family, and now they watched her return, bruised but alive. The aftermath of Elizabeth's abduction shook the nation, but her story became one of courage and strength. She went on to become a vocal advocate for the rights of kidnapping victims and worked tirelessly to raise awareness about child abduction and human trafficking. The darkness of the Mexican border. The border is often portrayed as a place of opportunity, where dreams are realized and hopes are fulfilled. But for many, it is a place of nightmares, a land where people are lost to the shadows, where the darkness claims them, and where the most harrowing stories go untold. The journey through the Mexican border is fraught with danger, and for Maria it was the beginning of a nightmare she would never forget. Maria had heard the whispers of a better life. They echoed through her small village, past the broken homes and fields of dust. Life in Mexico was hard, harder than it had ever been before. The economy was in shambles, and her family struggled daily just to survive. They had enough to get by, but that was all. She was just 18 when she first heard about the people who made it across the border into the United States. Stories of a new world, of freedom, opportunity, and wealth. Stories of people who escaped their pasts and built something better. She didn't know the details, but she knew that it was possible. Her family had nothing left to lose, and Maria felt an overpowering pull to seek a life away from the suffocating poverty. The idea of escaping had been planted in her mind for months, and with each passing day, it grew stronger. She met a man named Javier, who said he could help her get to the other side. He was a coyote, a guide who helped people cross the border for a fee. Javier promised her safety, a path through the harsh desert, and a way into a new life. He even spoke of a job waiting for her in the U.S. It was the kind of hope that Maria clung to with all her strength, the kind of hope that would push her to make choices she could never take back. She told her parents she was going to visit relatives in a neighboring town. It was the perfect excuse to slip away unnoticed. The day she left, she felt the weight of her decision, part excitement, part fear. She didn't know how dangerous the journey would be. She didn't know what was lurking just beyond the horizon. The journey began at night. Javier met her at a small bus station just outside the city, away from the prying eyes of the authorities. The air was cool, but the darkness seemed to cling to everything, thick and heavy. A small group of people, some strangers, some old friends, had gathered, all eager to leave behind their old lives in search of something better. They huddled together, listening to Javier's instructions. "Stay close," he warned. "Don't make a sound. Don't draw attention to yourselves." Maria nodded, her heart racing. She had heard of the dangers, of kidnappings, assaults, and the brutal desert conditions, but she didn't know how real they were. The stories sounded far away, almost unreal. But now, as the group began to move, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread creep over her. They walked through the darkened streets, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick layers of dust that covered the ground. The silence felt suffocating. As they left the town behind, the world seemed to grow darker. Soon, the lights of civilization disappeared entirely, and they were left in the vast emptiness of the desert. Hours passed, the landscape stretching endlessly before them. The stars were barely visible, the moon hidden behind thick clouds that had begun to roll in. The only sound was the wind, howling, eerie, and constant. Maria's legs ached, but she pushed forward, keeping close to the others, trying to ignore the gnawing fear in her stomach. They stopped for a brief rest, but Javier was growing impatient. His eyes flickered nervously in the darkness, constantly scanning the horizon. He told them to keep moving. The night stretched on. Maria could feel the weight of the desert pressing against her, the air thick and oppressive. It wasn't just the heat or the exhaustion, it was something more. Something dark, like an unseen force, watching them, waiting for them to slip up. By the time dawn broke, they were deep into the desert. The sun's harsh light burned the horizon, casting long shadows across the dry earth. But there was no time for rest. The group was told to keep moving. As the day wore on, the heat became unbearable. Maria's water had long run out, and the others in the group weren't much better off. Some were beginning to falter, their steps slower, their bodies weaker. Javier kept urging them forward, his voice tense with urgency. It was in the early afternoon when the first sign of trouble appeared. A truck, black and menacing, rumbled across the distant horizon. At first it seemed like a blessing. Help had arrived, or so they thought. But as the vehicle drew closer, something wasn't right. The truck didn't stop, didn't slow down. Instead, it sped toward them, its tires kicking up clouds of dust in its wake. Javier's eyes widened. "Move! Now!" Panic swept through the group. People scattered in all directions, some running towards the cliffs, others towards the sparse trees that dotted the desert landscape. But the truck wasn't interested in anyone but Maria. It honked its horn and swerved toward her, its engine roaring. She felt her heart leap into her throat, her breath short as she turned to run, but her legs felt as though they were made of stone. She wasn't fast enough. The truck stopped inches from her, and the door slammed open. A man with cold eyes stepped out, grinning like a predator. "Get in," he said, his voice low and grating. "You're coming with us." Maria froze. The others had disappeared into the desert, but this man wasn't asking. He was telling. His hand reached for her, and the terror that gripped her was unlike anything she had ever felt before. Javier had vanished, leaving her alone to face whatever nightmare was unfolding. She felt the world spin around her as she was dragged into the truck. It was a soundless scream, her body moving of its own accord as fear took over her. Inside the truck there were others, women, young girls, their eyes empty, their faces hollow. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just stared ahead, lost in the same terror Maria now felt. The truck took them deeper into the desert. The heat was stifling, and the hours felt like days. Maria's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. What had she gotten herself into? How could this be happening? She had crossed the border, but not into the promised land of opportunity. She had crossed into something much darker, something much worse. By the time they reached a secluded compound hidden in the desert, Maria's resolve had shattered. She was thrown into a small windowless room, her hands bound to a chair. The men who had taken her were not the coyotes she had trusted. They were human traffickers, part of an underground network that sold women into slavery. Days turned into weeks, and Maria's world became a blur of fear and helplessness. The room was dim, the air thick with the stench of sweat and despair. Her captors came and went, but their faces never changed. They were cold, indifferent to her suffering. She wasn't a person to them. She was a commodity, a thing to be sold. It wasn't until a few weeks later that she saw a glimmer of hope, a crack in the door of her nightmare. The compound was raided by authorities after an anonymous tip led them to the location. The traffickers were arrested, and Maria was freed. But the scars they left behind were permanent, etched into her soul. Maria's escape was rare, but it is a testament to the horrors that happen every day at the border. She made it out, but so many others aren't as lucky. The darkness of the Mexican border is not just about crossing into a new world. It's about what lurks in the shadows, waiting to trap the vulnerable, to exploit their hopes and dreams. Maria's story is a haunting reminder of the dangers that lie in the search for a better life and the nightmares that can follow. The horror in the subways of New York. In the heart of New York City, where the pulse of life is constant, there exists a dark, terrifying secret that very few know about or choose to ignore. The subways, the veins of the city, carry not only people from one place to another, but something far more sinister. An underworld that thrives in the shadows, where victims are lost, and horror becomes a daily reality. The story of Emily's disappearance is one such tale, one that still haunts those who dare to remember. The rumble of the subway echoed through the tunnels, its vibrations felt deep in the bones of the city. Emily stood on the crowded platform, her mind weary after a long day of work. The evening rush hour was in full force, a sea of tired, frustrated faces all pushing towards the trains. For Emily, it was just another routine ride home. The same subway line, the same stop, the same trains. She had done this for years, no reason to believe tonight would be any different. But as she stepped onto the train, there was something that felt off. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but something about the atmosphere on that train seemed different. The lights flickered, casting brief shadows that danced across the passengers' faces. A strange hush seemed to hang in the air, even as the train filled with bodies. It felt like a pressure building, something unseen but ever present. The hum of the train was almost deafening, yet there was a quietness that suffocated the car, a strange stillness. Emily tried to shake it off, reminding herself that it was just another busy day. She found a seat near the window and pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages, trying to tune out the mundane sounds of the commute. But then she noticed him. A man stood near the door watching her. At first, she thought it was just another tired commuter, but as she glanced up, the man's eyes locked onto hers. He wasn't like the others. There was something unsettling about the way he stared, his gaze cold and unblinking. She quickly looked away, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It was as if time slowed. The other passengers on the train seemed to fade into the background, their faces becoming blurred. All Emily could focus on was the man. She stole another glance, and he was still staring, unmoving. His face was pale, his clothes old and tattered, as if he hadn't seen a fresh change in years. The train's lights flickered again, and Emily felt a sharp chill crawl down her spine. The air in the car felt heavy, like a storm was brewing. The man took a step toward her. His movement was unnatural, like something that didn't quite belong in the world of the living. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, his eyes never leaving hers. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. The doors of the subway car opened at the next station, but instead of exiting, the man stepped closer. Emily took a step back, her breath quickening. She was now trapped between the man and the door. He reached out, his hand grazing her arm in a way that sent a wave of terror through her body. A voice in her head screamed at her to get away, but her body was frozen in place. The man leaned in, his breath cold against her ear, and whispered, "You don't belong here." She couldn't move. His words felt like an icy dagger, the chill spreading through her chest. The train jerked forward, the doors closing. But the man didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He simply stood there, watching her, as if she were his prey. The train came to an abrupt stop at the next station. A few people rushed to the door, eager to leave the tension of the cramped car. But Emily stayed still, her body numb. She glanced to her right, desperate to find someone who could help, but everyone was staring straight ahead. No one seemed to acknowledge the man. When the doors opened again, she didn't hesitate. She bolted off the train, stumbling as she stepped onto the platform. The cool air hit her face, but she didn't feel relief. She looked back at the train, but the doors had already closed, the sound of the wheels rumbling down the tracks growing fainter with each passing second. But there was something even more terrifying now. The man was gone. He hadn't followed her, hadn't moved a muscle since she had left the train. Emily couldn't explain it. It was as if he had never existed. The people around her were normal commuters, just another crowd making their way through the bustling subway. No one had seen the man. No one had noticed the same eerie atmosphere she had felt. She tried to push the unsettling experience from her mind, brushing it off as some figment of her overactive imagination. After all, it had been a long day. But the feeling of dread wouldn't leave her. The next morning, Emily took the same subway line to work. The world outside the train was gray, the rain falling in sheets, making everything seem dull and muted. As she stepped onto the platform, she couldn't shake the lingering feeling from the night before. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just her nerves. As she descended the stairs into the subway station, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The platform was nearly empty, save for one person standing in the far corner. A man. His face pale and gaunt, his clothes old and worn. His eyes once again locked onto hers. The same man. Emily's heart raced as she froze in place, her breath catching in her throat. She looked around, her eyes darting to the other passengers, but no one else seemed to notice him. The world around her seemed to blur, the sounds of the station fading as her pulse pounded in her ears. Before she could turn and run, the man began to move toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. His gaze never left her face. This time, she couldn't move. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words wouldn't come. The closer he got, the colder the air seemed to grow. The platform felt darker, as if something was closing in on her. And then, as if summoned by some unseen force, the subway train arrived. It screeched to a halt, and the doors opened with a loud, metallic hiss. Without thinking, Emily stepped into the train, her eyes locked onto the man as he slowly reached for her. The doors slammed shut just as his hand grazed her sleeve. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to run, wanted to escape, but it felt like there was nowhere left to go. The train began its journey, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her reflection in the window was distorted, her face pale, her body shaking uncontrollably. She glanced around, but the other passengers remained oblivious. They were all so wrapped up in their own world, their own thoughts, while the darkness of the train seemed to close in around her. And then she heard it, a soft, whispering voice, barely audible above the hum of the train. "You can't escape," the voice murmured. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She turned, but there was no one there. The train was empty now. The lights flickered once more, and the whispers grew louder, echoing through the darkened subway car. The horror had only just begun. The subways of New York, like the city itself, are filled with both life and death, with light and darkness, and with secrets that remain hidden in the shadows. Emily's disappearance remains one of the many unsolved mysteries of the city, and to this day, no one knows what happened to her. The trains continue to run. The city moves forward. But the darkness is always watching. The hidden hell of human trafficking in Istanbul. Istanbul, a city that straddles two continents, the bridge between East and West. A city of ancient beauty, where the Bosphorus separates the modern world from the old. But beneath its dazzling surface lies a darkness that few dare to speak of. It is a place where victims vanish into the shadows, where innocent lives are stolen, and where the horrors of human trafficking unfold in secret. The story of Layla is one such story, one that exposes the brutal reality of a hidden hell that lurks beneath the city's historic streets. The sun had just begun to set over Istanbul, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. Layla stood in the busy Taksim Square, her heart pounding in her chest. It had been a long journey from her small village in eastern Turkey, but she was finally in the city, ready to make a fresh start. Layla was young, just 21, full of hope and ambition. She had heard the stories from friends who had traveled to Istanbul. They spoke of opportunities, of jobs that could change a life forever. The city was full of promise, they said, a place where dreams could come true. It seemed like the perfect escape from the oppressive poverty of her rural home. She had been in contact with a man named Farid, someone she met through a friend in her village. He had promised her a job as a waitress in one of Istanbul's upscale restaurants. He assured her that she would be taken care of, and that she would make good money. The idea of working in a city with endless opportunities was too appealing to ignore. Layla had packed her things and left without a second thought. As she stepped off the bus, the excitement bubbled inside her. The lights of the city, the bustling crowds, the towering buildings, they were nothing like the small village she had known her entire life. She felt a thrill, but also a twinge of fear. The city was overwhelming, unfamiliar. She was alone, with no one but Farid to rely on. Layla's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from him. "I'll be there to pick you up in 10 minutes, don't worry. Everything is going to be fine." Layla breathed a sigh of relief. She wasn't alone. She had someone who would guide her through this new world. The promise of a job, of safety, was enough to quell the anxiety that had been building since she arrived. She glanced at her surroundings, waiting for Farid to appear. But as the minutes passed, the crowd around her seemed to grow. The faces of the people around her blurred into a sea of strangers, their features indistinguishable. Layla couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She shifted nervously from foot to foot, scanning the crowd, but there was no sign of Farid. A tap on her shoulder made her jump. "Layla?" a deep voice said. She turned around, her heart leaping in her chest. The man standing before her wasn't Farid. His face was unfamiliar, his features sharp and cold. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity. "You're Layla, right?" the man asked again, his voice like gravel. Before she could answer, he stepped forward, his hand grabbing her arm with unexpected force. "Come with me." "Where's Farid?" she asked, pulling back in confusion. The man didn't answer. Instead, he pulled her towards a narrow alley that ran alongside the square. Layla's pulse quickened, her mind racing. This wasn't right. The uneasy feeling she had dismissed earlier was now becoming a gnawing sense of dread. She tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Where are you taking me?" The man didn't respond. He just dragged her further into the darkening alley, his grip tightening. The sounds of the bustling city behind them faded, replaced by the eerie silence of the narrow street. Layla's instincts screamed at her to run, but the fear that gripped her legs paralyzed her. Finally, they reached a door, small, unmarked, and seemingly insignificant. The man knocked twice, and the door opened. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and something else, something that made Layla's stomach turn. It was a dark, windowless room, and the moment she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her. Before she could react, the man shoved her into a chair. "Sit," he commanded, his voice low and menacing. Layla was too stunned to do anything but obey. Her mind raced, but the panic was clouding her thoughts. What was happening? Where was Farid? Why had he disappeared? As she sat there, her eyes darting around the room, she noticed several other women in the shadows, their faces blank and lifeless. Some were sitting, others standing, but they all shared the same vacant expression. Their eyes were dull, their movements slow and robotic. It was as if they were prisoners, trapped in some nightmare from which they could never escape. The man who had brought Layla into the room turned to one of the women. "Get her ready," he said coldly. The woman, thin, pale, and terrified, nodded, moving toward Layla. It was then that Layla noticed the strange look in her eyes, the fear that seemed to echo her own. She tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but no words came out. She was paralyzed, a sense of dread so intense it made her feel as though she were suffocating. The woman guided Layla to a corner of the room where a small bed lay covered in grimy sheets. Her mind raced, her body trembling with terror, but she couldn't move. She was trapped, and the thought of escape felt impossible. She realized with a sickening twist in her stomach that the other women had been through this before. This was their life now. For the next few hours, Layla was stripped of her dignity, her identity, and her hope. She was sold into a world of unspeakable horror, a world of exploitation, violence, and abuse. The man who had captured her was part of a human trafficking ring that operated in the shadows of Istanbul, smuggling women from all over the world into the dark corners of the city. They were forced into prostitution, sold to the highest bidder, their lives a nightmare from which they could never wake. Days passed in a blur of terror. Layla had no idea how long she had been in the hellish compound. The world outside had become a distant memory, a place she could no longer reach. She was fed only scraps of food, her body weak from the constant abuse. The other women, like her, had been stripped of their identities, their hope. They were shells of their former selves, nothing more than objects to be sold and used. The compound was hidden beneath the streets of Istanbul, tucked away in a network of old, abandoned buildings that had long since been forgotten. The traffickers kept their victims in tight quarters, where they were constantly monitored. Any attempt at escape was met with punishment, violent and swift. Layla's spirit began to wither, and she began to lose track of time. The days blurred into one another, a never-ending cycle of suffering and fear. But deep inside, a spark of defiance still remained. She refused to give in entirely. One night, after a particularly brutal assault by one of the men, Layla managed to slip away from her captors. She crawled through the dark halls of the building, her body battered, her mind desperate. She knew the city was out there, just beyond the walls of her prison. She could hear the faint hum of traffic, the distant cries of the busy streets, but she had no idea where to go, who to turn to. It was then that she met someone, another woman who had escaped the same fate. This woman had been living in the shadows of the city, surviving by any means she could. She took Layla to a safe house, a place where victims of human trafficking could find temporary refuge. The authorities were contacted, and after a tense few days they raided the compound, freeing Layla and the other women. Layla's escape was rare, but it is a story that shines a light on the dark underbelly of Istanbul. Beneath the vibrant city, behind the beauty and the bustling streets, a hidden hell exists, a hell where the lives of countless women are stolen and their suffering is unseen. Layla was fortunate to escape, but for many their stories remain untold, their voices silenced forever. This is the hidden horror of human trafficking in Istanbul, a horror that continues to haunt the city's shadows.